purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Madam Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 1065, I call up House Joint Resolution 45 with a Senate amendment thereto, and I have a motion at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution, designate the Senate amendment, and report the motion.
House Joint Resolution 45, joint resolution increasing the statutory limit on the public debt. Senate amendment. Mr. Hoyer of Maryland moves that the House concur in the Senate amendment to the House Joint Resolution 45.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1065, the motion shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader or their designees. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, will control 30 minutes. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, will control 15 minutes. And the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, will control 15 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
I thank the Speaker, and I yield myself 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, as we have on numerous occasions, we just raised the liability or the ability to pay of the United States a substantial amount. What we are doing now that we have not done in the last decade is to adopt a fiscal constraint at the same time. A fiscal constraint to get us to where every American wants us to be, and that is to fiscal balance, to a fiscally responsible government and a fiscally responsible country, to match the fiscal responsibility of most of our citizens. The House has just voted that our country should pay the bills it already incurred. Those obligations, of course, come from actions America has already taken. Those actions cannot be changed. So it was necessary to pay the bill. But we can and must confront our record debt going forward. We can and must set a more responsible path fiscally for our country. A New York Times analysis found that 90%. I yield myself 3 additional minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
A New York Times analysis found that 90% of our deficit is due to the policies of the previous administration, the extension of those policies, and the economic downturn. However we believe America got into this mess, this Congress can begin getting America out of it. That is why Congress must pass one of the most proven deficit-cutting tools we know, statutory pay-as-you-go legislation, or as it is affectionately known, pay-go. Now let me point out this chart. To my right, your left. The deficits are when we did not have statutory pay-go in effect. Now, when statutory pay-go was put into effect in 1990, we still had deficits, but you can see that we started reducing those deficits almost on a straight line. And then in 1997, we went into surplus, fiscal year 98. And we went into surplus for the next 4 years under pay-go. Unfortunately, you will see that in 2001, it was decided that we would waive pay-go. And then in 2003, it was decided by the then majority party that we would eliminate statutory pay-go. And you can see the result. We returned to deep deficits. So what we are voting on the floor has demonstrably made a difference, has demonstrably helped America discipline its finances and bring surpluses. As I said, when George Bush took office from President Clinton, his administration, based upon the past record of the Clinton administration, said we had a $5.6 trillion surplus. Unfortunately, for the country, when President Bush left office, we had an almost $8 trillion deficit confronting us. Pay-go compels Congress to find savings for the money it spends. so it keeps our deficit from increasing. Under PAYGO, we'll be required to find savings to balance any new tax cuts or entitlement spending, which makes this law essential to the wise prioritization that responsible budgeting demands, and indeed that our fellow citizens expect. As the Concord Coalition, a bipartisan fiscal responsibility group, put it, and I quote, PAYGO requires anyone proposing tax cuts or entitlement expansions to answer the question, how do you pay for it? Going through this process will force us an explicit trade-off between spending, taxes, and debt, which is exactly the priority-setting exercise that the budget process should and must facilitate. We all know that such deliberate priority-setting steps stops us from passing our bills onto our children. Under President Clinton, PAYGO helped turn, I yield myself 2 additional minutes.
Recognized.
Under President Clinton, PAYGO helped turn record deficits into a $5.6 billion projected surplus. We also know that PAYGO was disregarded, waived, and finally allowed to expire under the last administration. And as I have pointed out on this chart, our deficits exploded. And indeed, our economy was hurt as well as those deficits exploded. Some argue that the PAYGO legislation on the floor today is too weak. But I point out that it brings our country more fiscal discipline than it has seen in nearly a decade. The perfect ought not to be the enemy of the good. PAYGO can't get us out of our fiscal hole, but it can keep us from digging it deeper. When my Republican colleagues raise their concerns about our growing debt, I absolutely agree with them. They're right. All of us understand this debt is not sustainable. But it's not enough to complain about the debt. We have to do something about it. If my colleagues are sincere in their concerns, I hope they'll work with us to pass PAYGO and continue to the Bipartisan Fiscal Commission announced by President Obama. I hope you'll participate in that commission, helping us get our country to fiscal balance. America's dangerous fiscal condition threatens our prosperity and our place in the world. If my colleagues will forgive a Democrat for paraphrasing Ronald Reagan, there are no easy answers to this mess, but there is a simple answer. The answer lies in recommitting ourselves to the principle that has served our prosperity so well in the past, the principle of responsibility. Ronald Reagan was right. Let us pass this legislation. In closing, let me say, Madam Speaker, that so many people are responsible for this day. The Blue Dogs, I want to congratulate them. In a minute, I'm going to yield to Alan Boyd, who has led this effort on behalf of the Blue Dogs for such a long and successful time. I also want 30 additional seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
I also want to congratulate an extraordinary individual who worked for an individual who's not on this floor, Charlie Stenholm, who deserves a portion of the credit this day for this legislation. And he was assisted, as I am now assisted, as all of the House is assisted, by an extraordinary member of our staff, Ed Lorenzen. Ed, I want to thank you personally for the extraordinary efforts you have made to get us to this day. Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.